It's 11:47 at night, and you're still awake because of something you said 4 hours ago. Maybe it was a comment at dinner. Maybe it was the way you laughed a beat too loud, or the pause before you answered a simple question, a pause that felt to you like it lasted an hour. You are lying there running it back, frame by frame, the way you might rewind a tape looking for a scratch you're sure is there. You are certain someone noticed. You are certain they are thinking about it too, right now in their own bed, in their own dark room. They are not. That sentence should feel strange to read, maybe even a little insulting, but sit with it for a moment, because there is something waiting on the other side of that discomfort, something that took thinkers across 2,000 years of human history to fully articulate. And it changes far more than how you sleep at night. It changes how you walk into a room. It changes what you say and don't say. It changes who you become when you finally stop performing for an audience that was never watching the show. There is a version of you that exists only in your own head, a version built entirely out of guesses about what other people think. You have spent years polishing that version, defending it, apologizing to it, losing sleep over it. And somewhere in that process, you quietly handed your peace of mind to strangers who were never holding it in the first place. This is the story of what happens when you finally take it back. You can probably picture other nights like this one without much effort. A holiday dinner years ago, where you said something at the table that landed wrong, and you can still feel the exact temperature of the room in that silence. A work presentation from a decade back, where your voice cracked slightly on one word, and you were sure everyone clocked it, filed it away, judged you for it quietly behind polite faces. These moments feel etched into you with unusual permanence, as if they were carved rather than simply remembered. And yet, if you asked the people who were actually present, most of them would struggle to recall the dinner at all, let alone the sentence that has lived rent-free in your head for years. There is a strange asymmetry at the heart of human memory, and almost no one escapes it. What burns for you barely flickers for them. Somewhere in that gap between your memory and theirs is a door, and on the other side of it is a version of your life with far less weight to carry. Most people never notice the size of the audience they've invented for themselves. It doesn't arrive all at once. It builds slowly, one small moment at a time, until it feels like a fact of life rather than a habit of mind. You choose a shirt in the morning and wonder, for half a second, what it says about you. You say something in a meeting and spend the drive home replaying the reaction on a colleague's face, deciding what it meant. You send a text, then reread it 3 times before it's answered, searching for a tone you might have gotten wrong. None of this feels dramatic in the moment. It feels like ordinary life. But underneath it is a quiet, constant tax being paid to an audience that, if you ask them, could barely recall the moment at all. Picture something simple. You're standing in the checkout line at the grocery store, and your card gets declined on the first try. Your face goes warm. You glance behind you, certain the man in line is judging you, filing you away as careless, disorganized, someone who can't manage his own finances. You tap the card again. It goes through, and you walk to your car rehearsing an explanation you will never actually give to anyone. That man, meanwhile, forgot about you before you'd even reached your car. He was thinking about his own declined card from last week, or what he was making for dinner, or nothing at all. You handed him a role in your private courtroom, and he never even auditioned for the part. This habit doesn't stay confined to grocery stores and dinner parties. It follows you into your closest relationships, where it quietly convinces you to say less than you mean, to agree when you don't, to shrink your opinions down to a size you assume will be more acceptable. It follows you into your career, where it can keep you from raising your hand, proposing the idea, applying for the role, because some imagined panel of judges might find you wanting. Over years, it doesn't just cost you comfort. It costs you the version of your life you might have lived if you had trusted, even slightly, that most people are far too occupied with their own private courtroom to spend much time presiding over yours. Think about a family gathering, the kind that happens every year around the same table, with the same relatives, the same slightly too long silences between courses. Someone asks what you've been doing lately, and instead of answering honestly, you find yourself quietly editing, choosing the version of your life that sounds more impressive, more settled, more like something that won't invite a follow-up question you'd rather not answer. You do this so automatically you barely notice it happening. But underneath that small edit is the same old assumption that the people around that table are keeping score, tallying up your choices, ready to compare them against some standard you've never actually seen written down anywhere. In truth, most of them are wondering the exact same thing about how their own answer landed, running their own private edit in real time, just a few feet away from yours. Over years, this quiet editing compounds into something larger than any single conversation. It becomes the shape of a life lived slightly sideways, angled always toward an audience, rarely angled toward what you actually wanted. You take the safer job instead of the interesting one. You stay quiet in the meeting when you had the better idea. You wear the outfit that draws less attention, rather than the one you actually liked in the mirror. None of these choices feel dramatic in isolation. But strung together across 20 or 30 years, they add up to something worth noticing, a life edited for an audience that, on any given day, was mostly distracted by its own reflection. Here is the shift, the one idea that everything else in this video will return to. The people you fear are watching you are, in almost every case, absorbed in watching themselves. Not out of cruelty, not out of indifference, simply because that is how a human mind works. Each person carries their own private audience in their head, and they are its main subject, the way you are the main subject of yours. This is not a cynical idea about human nature. It is, strangely, one of the kindest. It means the eyes you have spent your life flinching from were mostly turned inward the entire time. The Stoic philosophers understood this centuries before modern psychology gave it a name. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor who kept a private journal never intended for publication, returned again and again to a simple discipline: separate what belongs to you from what does not. Other people's opinions, their judgments, the stories they tell themselves about you, none of that belongs to you. It was never yours to carry. He wrote to himself as a reminder, not as a performance, which tells you something important. Even a man with the power to command an empire still had to practice letting go of what strangers thought of him. If someone with that much authority needed the reminder, the rest of us can forgive ourselves for needing it too. Epictetus, who had been born into slavery before becoming one of the most influential teachers of his age, built an entire philosophy around a single distinction that he taught to his students in Nicopolis. Some things are within your control. Your judgments, your choices, your effort. Everything else, including what other people think of you, sits outside that boundary. Suffering, he argued, comes from confusing the two, from trying to control what was never yours to control in the first place. When you spend an evening worrying about a stranger's opinion, you are, in his framework, laboring over something that was never within your reach to begin with, while neglecting the one thing that was always yours: how you choose to respond. Seneca, writing letters to his friend Lucilius near the end of his own life, returned often to how much of our time gets stolen by concerns that don't deserve it. He observed that people guard their money and their property carefully, refusing to let others take what belongs to them, and yet they hand over their time and attention freely to anyone who asks for it, including the imagined judgments of people who will forget the interaction by morning. He considered this one of the great, quiet tragedies of a life poorly lived, not that it was short, but that so much of it was spent on things that never mattered. It's worth pausing here to notice something these three Stoic writers shared. None of them arrived at this philosophy from a position of comfort or detachment from real life. Marcus Aurelius carried the weight of an empire and the judgment of an entire Roman public. Epictetus had lived through the total loss of control that comes with enslavement before earning his freedom and his reputation as a teacher. Seneca served as an advisor at the unpredictable, often dangerous court of Emperor Nero, where a single misstep could cost far more than embarrassment. These were not men shielded from real consequence, writing comfortable theories from a safe distance. They built this philosophy precisely because they understood, in the most immediate terms possible, how much suffering comes from chasing approval you cannot control, and how much steadiness becomes available once you finally let that chase go. The Buddhist tradition arrives at something remarkably similar from an entirely different direction. Central to Buddhist teaching is the idea that clinging to a fixed, defended sense of self is itself a source of suffering. When you build your identity around how others perceive you, you create something fragile that must be protected at every turn, flinched over, defended in arguments you never even have out loud. Loosening that grip, not by disappearing or becoming passive, but by holding your sense of self more lightly, is described across Buddhist teaching as a doorway to a steadier kind of peace. The goal was never to stop existing in the eyes of others. It was to stop needing their eyes in order to feel whole. Centuries later, the French essayist Michel de Montaigne, writing during a period of religious war and public upheaval, withdrew to his family's tower to think and write honestly about his own life. He observed that most people live entirely outward, arranging themselves according to the opinions of others, and rarely turn their attention inward to ask what they themselves actually think or want. He considered this one of the quiet dangers of public life, the slow erosion of a private self, replaced by a self constructed for an audience. His writing became, in many ways, a record of a man teaching himself to live for his own honest reasons rather than for the approval of a crowd. He would never fully know. What's happening in your mind when you replay a conversation at midnight has a name in modern psychology, and it isn't a flaw unique to you. Researchers studying self-perception identified what's known as the spotlight effect, a well-documented tendency for people to dramatically overestimate how much others notice and remember about them. In studies on the subject, participants consistently believed that far more people had observed small embarrassing moments, a stain on a shirt, a stumble over words, than actually had. The mind, it turns out, is not a neutral recorder of how much attention we receive. It is a machine that assumes it is the center of every room it enters, even when the evidence says otherwise. This isn't vanity. It's closer to a wiring quirk, a byproduct of the fact that you experience your own life from the inside of your own head, every second of every day. While you only glimpse other people's lives from the outside in passing, because your embarrassment feels enormous to you, your mind assumes it must look enormous to everyone else too. But they are living inside their own head, absorbed in their own worries, their own declined credit cards and unanswered texts, with roughly the same amount of spare attention left over for you that you have left over for them, which, on most days, is very little. Try this small test the next time you're at a family gathering or a work event. Look around the room and ask yourself honestly, how much attention you're actually giving to any single other person's shirt, their comment from 10 minutes ago, the way they laughed at something slightly too loud. The honest answer is usually almost none. Your attention is on your own drink, your own next sentence, your own mental checklist of things to do tomorrow. Now apply the same math in reverse. Everyone else in that room is running that same internal checklist, with you appearing on it only briefly, if at all. This isn't a depressing realization once you sit with it. It's closer to relief, the kind that comes from finally understanding that the room was never as watchful as it felt from inside your own head. There's a second layer to this worth understanding, one that the Austrian psychologist Alfred Adler explored in depth. Adler argued that a great deal of human unhappiness comes from what he called the entanglement of tasks, taking on the emotional weight of decisions and judgments that actually belong to someone else. Whether a person approves of you, likes you, agrees with you, that is their task, shaped by their own history, mood, and perspective, and it was never yours to manage. Adler suggested that real freedom begins the moment you stop trying to control how you are perceived and instead focus entirely on living according to your own honest values. Not because other people's feelings don't matter, but because their opinions of you were never a task assigned to your hands in the first place. Consider how this plays out with something as ordinary as a decision to change careers later in life, a move plenty of people quietly consider and just as quietly abandon. Underneath the practical questions, the real hesitation is often a fear of what others will think, whether it looks impulsive, whether it signals some kind of failure in the life built up to this point. Adler's framework offers a clean, almost surgical distinction here. Whether the decision is wise, given your own values and circumstances, that task belongs entirely to you. Whether someone else approves of it, that task belongs entirely to them, and no amount of explaining, justifying, or softening the announcement will ever fully guarantee their approval. Once you stop trying to manage a task that was never yours, a decision that once felt paralyzing often becomes far simpler to make. There's a particular moment worth picturing here, one that many people recognize instantly once it's described. You're at a small gathering, maybe 8 or 10 people, and someone brings up a topic you actually have a strong opinion about. You feel the words forming, feel how much you want to say them, and then, almost involuntarily, you soften them, round off the edges, add a qualifier that wasn't really necessary, because some part of you is scanning the room, gauging whether the full, honest version of your opinion might make someone uncomfortable or think less of you. By the time you actually speak, what comes out is a smaller, safer version of what you meant. Nobody in that room asked you to shrink your opinion. You did it on your own, preemptively, defending against a judgment that, statistically speaking, was far more likely to exist only in your imagination than in the minds of the people actually sitting across the table. Understanding an idea is one thing. Living inside it, especially in the heat of an anxious moment, is another. So here is a practice you can use the very next time you feel the old panic rising, the flushed face, the racing thought that someone noticed and is judging you for it. Pause for 10 seconds before reacting. Not longer, just 10 seconds. Enough time to ask yourself one honest question. Will this matter to anyone else in a week? Not to you, to them. In nearly every case, the honest answer is no. This isn't about suppressing the feeling or pretending it away. It's about interrupting the automatic assumption long enough to let a more accurate one arrive in its place. This works because anxious spirals feed on speed. They move fast, jumping straight from a small trigger to a catastrophic conclusion before your reasoning mind has a chance to weigh in. 10 seconds sounds almost too small to matter, but it's enough to interrupt that momentum, enough to let a slower, more accurate part of your thinking catch up with the racing part. Over time, this pause becomes less of a deliberate technique and more of an automatic habit, the same way flinching away from a hot stove eventually becomes instinct rather than a conscious choice. That exercise handles the moment. But there's a deeper pattern underneath it, built over years, that a single pause won't undo on its own. For that, try keeping a short log for 1 week, nothing elaborate, just a notebook or a note on your phone. Each time you catch yourself spiraling over what someone might think, write down the moment and, a day or two later, come back and write down what actually happened. Did they mention it? Did they even remember? Over time, this log becomes its own quiet evidence file, a record built from your own life rather than a philosopher's argument, proving again and again that the audience you feared was smaller and more distracted than you imagined. Evidence changes minds faster than reasoning alone ever can. This second exercise matters more than it might first appear, because it works on a different timescale than the first. The 10-second pause interrupts a single spiral in real time. The weekly log rewires the underlying assumption that fuels every future spiral by replacing an abstract belief with a personal track record. Most people who try this exercise honestly report the same pattern by the end of the week. The vast majority of entries end with some version of, "They never mentioned it," or, "I don't think they even noticed." That pattern, seen with your own eyes and written in your own handwriting, tends to land with far more weight than simply being told the idea secondhand, however convincingly it's argued. Beyond these two exercises, a nightly ritual can help the lesson take root rather than fade by morning. Before bed, spend 5 quiet minutes, notebook in hand if you like, and walk yourself through 4 simple questions. What moment today am I still replaying in my mind? Whose opinion am I assuming, without any real evidence that I know it? What would I have said or done today if I weren't picturing an audience? And is there one small thing tomorrow I can do differently, not to be braver for its own sake, but simply because it's honestly mine to do? These questions aren't meant to produce guilt or a tidy resolution every night. Some nights the honest answer will simply be that you don't know yet, and that's allowed. The value is in the asking, repeated night after night, until it becomes less of an exercise and more of a reflex. The reason this needs to be a ritual, something repeated on a fixed schedule rather than something you turn to only in a crisis, comes down to how habits of mind actually form. A single insight, however powerful it feels the moment you hear it, tends to fade within days if nothing reinforces it. The old pattern, the one you've practiced for decades, has years of repetition behind it, and a few minutes of reflection won't outweigh that on its own. But 5 minutes a night, returned to consistently, slowly builds a competing pattern, one strong enough to eventually stand alongside the old one, and in time, to quiet it. This is less about willpower and more about patience. You are not trying to win an argument with your anxious mind in a single evening. You are teaching it something new, the way you would teach anything else worth learning, through steady, unremarkable repetition. Underneath all of this sits a root, because that rarely gets named directly, because it doesn't feel like fear of judgment on the surface. It feels like fear of judgment, but if you follow it down far enough, you often find something else waiting, a fear of being insignificant. Somewhere along the way, many people quietly absorb the idea that being watched is proof of mattering, that if no one is paying attention, then perhaps you don't count for much at all. So the anxious, exhausting habit of imagining an audience isn't really about fearing their disapproval. It's about needing their attention as evidence that you exist in a way that matters. That's a heavy thing to ask strangers to provide, and it was never a fair job to hand them. This root explains something that might otherwise seem strange, why the fear rarely fades on its own, no matter how much evidence accumulates against it. If the fear were only about specific judgments, a single piece of contrary evidence, someone forgetting your mistake, someone responding warmly instead of critically, would resolve it. But because the fear is secretly about mattering, about proof that your existence registers to anyone at all, no single piece of evidence can fully satisfy it. The craving underneath keeps generating new scenarios to worry about, because the real hunger was never about this particular moment. Recognizing that hunger for what it actually is, a need to feel significant, rather than mistaking it for a need to be liked or approved of, is often the first real step toward loosening its grip. This is exactly where the idea deserves a careful correction, because no one cares can sound, at first, like something bleak, even a little nihilistic. It is not. The people who love you, who have built a life alongside yours, parents, partners, close friends, children, they do care, deeply and specifically, and nothing here suggests otherwise. What the philosophy points to is much narrower, and once you see it, far can the vast majority of the world, strangers in a checkout line, distant acquaintances, people scrolling past a photo, are not tracking you the way your anxious mind insists they are. Letting go of their imagined judgment doesn't shrink your significance. It simply redirects your energy toward the people whose care for you was real all along, instead of spending it on an audience that was, quite literally, never in the theater. There's another misconception worth untangling here, closely related to the first. Accepting that people aren't watching you as closely as you feared does not mean becoming careless, cold, or indifferent to how you treat others. Some people hear this idea and swing too far, using it as an excuse to stop considering anyone else's feelings at all. That isn't freedom. That's just a different kind of imprisonment, one built on carelessness instead of anxiety. The goal was never to stop caring about people. It was to stop performing for an imagined jury that was never actually seated in the room. You can still be kind, still be considerate, still show up thoughtfully for the people in your life, all without the exhausting, invisible weight of assuming every stranger is silently scoring your every move. The mind carries this pattern, but the body carries it too, often in ways you don't consciously notice until you pay attention. Shallow, high-chest breathing tends to accompany the anxious anticipation of judgment, a kind of bracing the body does before it expects to be evaluated. When you notice that old spiral beginning, try slowing your exhale so it lasts longer than your inhale, 4 counts in, 6 counts out, for even 1 minute. This simple shift signals safety to your nervous system in a way that thinking alone rarely manages on its own, and it often loosens the mental spiral before the mind even catches up to what the body already knows. A second, equally simple habit is the phone-free walk, 10 or 15 minutes, no earbuds, no scrolling, just movement and open attention. Much of the anxious replaying that happens at night is actually unfinished mental processing looking for a quiet moment to complete itself, and walking, free from input and distraction, gives the mind exactly the kind of space it needs to work through the day's residue on its own. You don't need to force resolution or insight during the walk. Often it arrives on its own, somewhere around the second or third loop around the block, once the mind has had enough uninterrupted space to settle. Notice, too, how posture tends to shift the moment self-consciousness creeps in. Shoulders round forward, the chin tucks slightly down, the whole body seems to fold inward, as though trying to take up less space in the room. This isn't something you consciously choose. It's an old, automatic response, the body's attempt to become smaller and less noticeable when it senses possible judgment nearby. You don't need to force an exaggerated, chest-out posture to counter it. Something as simple as gently rolling your shoulders back and lifting your gaze to eye level, especially in a moment when you feel that old flush of self-consciousness rising, sends a quiet signal back to the nervous system that there is nothing here to brace against. Over time, this small physical adjustment and the mental shift toward trusting an inattentive world tend to reinforce each other, each one making the other a little easier to hold on to. Bring all of this together and you can see how each piece connects to the one before it. First, you notice the invisible audience you've been performing for your entire life, built out of guesses rather than evidence. Then, you learn that this audience was mostly imagined, that the spotlight effect distorts how much attention others actually pay, and that philosophers from Rome to India to a small French tower were describing some version of this same freedom long before modern psychology confirmed it. Next, you practice interrupting the pattern in real time, with a 10-second pause, a weekly log, a nightly ritual of honest questions. Finally, you correct the two ways this idea can be misunderstood, remembering that the people who truly love you still matter enormously, and that releasing an imagined audience is not permission to stop caring about anyone at all. None of these pieces work particularly well in isolation. The philosophy without the practice stays an interesting idea you nod along to and forget by the following week. The practice without the philosophy becomes a hollow technique, something you do without understanding why it matters, which rarely survives the first difficult day. But together, the understanding and the repetition reinforce each other. The way a plant needs both the right soil and consistent water, neither one sufficient without the other. This is why the exercises in this video were never meant as a quick fix, something to try once and abandon when it doesn't immediately transform your life. They are a daily practice, meant to sit quietly underneath your days the way breathing does, mostly unnoticed, until the moment you need it and find it's already there. Go back to that night at 11:47 still replaying the comment, still certain someone is thinking about it in their own dark room. Now you know the truth of that moment more clearly than you did an hour ago. They are not thinking about it. They likely never were. The version of you they're carrying in their mind, if they're carrying one at all, is smaller, blurrier, and far less detailed than the one you've built and defended and lost sleep over. That isn't a sad thing to accept. It's the beginning of getting your evenings back, your honesty back, your unguarded opinions back, all the parts of yourself you quietly handed to an audience that was never really watching the show. Try this tonight or tomorrow morning, if tonight has already passed you by. The next time you feel that old flush of worry over what someone might think, pause for 10 seconds and ask the honest question. You don't need a dramatic transformation by next week. Real change here comes slowly, through repetition, through small moments practiced again and again, until they start to feel less effort and more like who you are. There will likely be setbacks along the way, evenings where the old pattern wins, where you find yourself back at 11:47, replaying something small until it feels enormous again. That isn't failure. It's simply how any long practiced habit unwends, gradually, with occasional relapses, rather than in one clean break. What matters is not that you get it right every single time, but that you keep returning to the practice the way you'd return to a friend after a disagreement, without needing perfection to justify the return. Somewhere down that road, you'll notice you're saying what you actually mean more often, wearing what you actually like, living a little closer to the life that was always yours to live. And when the old anxious thought creeps back in, as it sometimes will, you can meet it with a quieter, steadier line. They were never watching as closely as you feared, and that was always your freedom, waiting patiently to be claimed. If this way of thinking spoke to something in you, there's a good chance the next video waiting for you will too. Philosophy like this rewards patience, one honest idea at a time, and there's another lesson just ahead worth sitting with in the same quiet way you sat with this one. Take a moment when you're ready, and let the next one find you.